let me start by asking you, Mike, you first grew up in New Jersey, and you were really coming of age at a time when the Cold War was really kind of heating up. Do you
Exactly.
recall the first time you heard about this country, Vietnam, and how it might somehow be involved in this struggle between the U.S. and communism?
I really hadn't heard about Vietnam. Until I was in the Marine Corps in Quantico, going to school when they had the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But certainly knew about communism. I grew up in junior high school. They had fallout shelters in some of the schools, and uh, a lot of concern about the communist threat, and so I think we were focused on, Cuba had just aligned itself with this Soviet Union, and Fidel Castro had, and so as I mentioned in one of our earlier conversations, it was John F. Kennedy who said, we've got to stop the spread of communism.
And you actually went and heard President Kennedy speak at an event, didn't you?
Exactly. When he was a candidate for the presidency, I was going to Seton Hall, and I saw an announcement that he would be speaking at the City Hall in Paterson, New Jersey. And so I took an afternoon off from school. I got down there around noon, and there really weren't that many people. He actually was on the steps speaking, and terrific speaker, as you remember. And he said that I think it's time we reverse the spread of communism. And I came from a patriotic family. My brother was in the Army. My uncle was in the Navy, served in World War II. I had a cousin in the Marines. And so, I was moved by his words. That was in 1960, in the fall of 1960. Uh, in January 61, in his inauguration address, he basically said, we'll pay any price, we'll bear any burden, uh, we'll meet any hardships, we'll support any friend. So that was the feeling in the country, and Kennedy was a primary motivator on that.
And did that get you started thinking about going into the military?
It did, and this was in the fall of 1961. Uh, I decided that I was going to look into how do I become a Marine Corps officer. And it's funny, we didn't have the technology we have today. I took a bus from northern New Jersey into the Port Authority building in New York City. And the first thing I did was I went to the Yellow Pages, look up, see where the Marine Corps Officer Selection Office was. And then I walked down there, walked in, and told them that I, wanted to find out what I had to do to become a Marine Corps officer. They gave me some preliminary tests. There's nothing like it is today. Today, it's really tough to get into the program. But, and next thing you know, I got sworn in that day. And I got orders to go to Quantico in the summer of 1962. Uh, Now, the program that they had, the PLC program, you remained in college and went during the summer. And you could go for one summer or 2 summers, but it was about either 10 weeks or 12 weeks. I'm proud to say that my grandson just finished that program, and he's going to be commissioned on May 15th as second lieutenant Marine Corps. But so I went through that program, was finished it during the summer, and then in 1964, upon graduation from college, I was commissioned into the Marine Corps, and then reported to Quantico.
So you went from being commissioned in the Marines in 1964, and then in 1965, you're in Vietnam. Were you
That's right.
surprised how quickly that occurred? Did you expect that?
Well, I knew things were happening quickly. I got married in December of 1964. Um, yeah, out of the, well, I was in the Marine Corps about 6 months at the time. And then in the spring of 65, as you recall, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and the schooling in Quantico, you could see, was being directed. The maps and everything we were we were using was obviously South Vietnam, North Vietnam. And so I got orders in October of 1965. My wife was about 6 months pregnant at the time, and had to say goodbye to her at Newark Airport, as many of the people who are in the military do today and had done it over the years, make that sacrifice of being separated. And it was a little bit more difficult for her. She was expected in a few months. So went straight to Okinawa first. They don't usually give you orders to Vietnam. They say Okinawa, but I was in Okinawa one day. And then the following day, landed at Da Nang Air Base. And this was a period of time when things weren't developed as they are now. I mean, the air base had metal runners down for the planes, and the tents were not strong back tents. They were just regular tents. And so I arrived there and did not know what my assignment would be and where I'd go. I had gone to a number of schools. Marine Corps had sent me to nuclear weapons school. I was hoping I wouldn't have to use any of that knowledge, to supply school. And of course, I had the training as an infantry officer. So I was there for one day, and the following day, a sergeant came. I distinctly remember his name. His name is unforgettable, Sergeant Cappuccino. And he came down. He was a sergeant in the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, which was an infantry battalion. And I chose to go to an infantry battalion. I also had a decision I could go into division headquarters or a regiment, but I thought going into a battalion, I'd be, let's say, not a big fish, but a little bit bigger fish than I would have been had I gone to division. And so it took me out to a position. It was about 35 miles from Da Nang, and that was the start. That was end of October 65.
And so, again, from being commissioned in 64 and going through various Marine Corps schools and training, and then suddenly in 1965, you find yourself leading men in combat in Vietnam. Were you ready for that? How did that transition feel?
Well, believe it or not, I think I was. I tell you this, the training that the Marine Corps gives you, number one, they emphasize having knowledge. And I had all the knowledge I needed as far as the weapon systems and the patrolling and strategy. And then secondly, confidence. Now, you have to realize I was, in 1965, was 22. Most of the men in my command were 18. That was about the average age. So even though I consider myself young, some of these guys thought I was a little bit older, you know. So you are, I think the Marine Corps, I have to give them a lot of credit. They don't put you in a position unless you're well trained to handle the responsibilities. However, I would say that the responsibilities are kind of overwhelming, because all of a sudden it has to do with the lives of people.
So, in that vein, you served in one of the war's earliest offensives, Operation Double Eagle, which involved joint operations between the Marine Corps, the Army 1st Cavalry, Navy units offshore, the South Vietnamese Army. So lots and lots of coordination. And yet, you tell me your communications capabilities as a combat leader on the ground were somewhat limited. Can you tell us a little about that?
They were. It's, you know, when you think of what they have today, we had a radio. It was PRC, Personal Radio Communication 6, and it had a range of about a mile. And so, I mean, you'd be better off if you had a cell phone, but they didn't have cell phones then, and we didn't have navigation systems, GPS. They gave us a map and an aerial photo. And so on that, in Double Eagle, I had responsibility to go ashore about 13 miles inshore in this, what they call the pincer movement. There were Marines who landed and went ashore off the, off the Valley Forge, is where there were actually two primary ships, the Valley Forge and the Princeton. There were 12 ships involved, but some of them were tankers and support ships. The hospital ship Repose, all those. About 5,000 Marines in total. It's quite an operation and quite a responsibility when you're 22 years old. And the Valley Forge is about 3 football fields long. I had never been on a ship that big. And so the morning of the landing, some people were going in on a landing craft. I was fortunate. I went in on a helicopter. We got dropped off, and our mission was to, once we got dropped off, to move eastward towards the shore, and the Vietnamese were coming from the north and the south. The intelligence said there were 5,300 Viet Cong in the area, and a school, and a training school. Well, when we got dropped off, I was fortunate to have a very good gunnery sergeant. He was 35 years old, so I really thought he was old. He had been in the Marine Corps 17 years. And we took out our maps and our aerial photo and looked to orient ourselves, and we had been dropped off by the helicopters in the wrong position. And we looked out, those helicopters looked like bees. They were heading back to the ship. And tried to get some contact, used my Prick 6, no contact with anybody else in its unit. Well, the first thing that would go through my mind was, if there's 5,300 VCs out there, we got a couple hundred guys, what do? Do you move towards the ocean? And what if you encounter this group? So trying to get a hold of the colonel, I couldn't. So we decided to set up a perimeter defense. It was late in the afternoon. So, and the reason it was late in the afternoon, that the waves that went in, there were more than 30 waves of landing craft and helicopters. Being a senior second lieutenant, first lieutenant, I'm fortunate I wasn't in charge of the first wave. First wave, they had senior first lieutenants and captains. So they had been making landings all day. And actually, when I was aboard ship waiting to make my landing, they were bringing back casualties. So they had run into some opposition. So we waited, night fell, we set up a perimeter, and the first thing in the morning, we didn't get hit at night. The first thing in the morning, I moved out towards the ocean, toward the South China Sea, constantly trying to make radio contact. And I finally did make radio contact with the colonel, who said some things that weren't very nice to me. He basically, where the hell have you been? But explained to him that we had been dropped off in the wrong place, and I did what I thought was the prudent thing to do. And so what happened was, there was some resistance that was met, but very minor. The 5,300 VC, if they were there, the intelligence, there had been a leak, and possibly by the South Vietnamese, but mostly they had escaped. I think there are a total of about 300 casualties in the Double Eagle, enemy kills rather, and about 100 friendly casualties. So that was it. We did find a training school, and that was interesting. They had weapons that had been recreated out of bamboo. It was very, one was a howitzer, working howitzer that the VCs had made. So went back aboard ship, and of course, I tend to be optimistic, and I told my men, maybe now that we're aboard ship, we'll probably go to Hong Kong or someplace like that. But we were only aboard 2 days, and we got recommitted. Now this time, first time was Tam Key, the second time was Chu Lai. That was Operation Double Eagle 2. And it was somewhat like the first one. There wasn't the kind of resistance that intelligence was telling. Obviously, there were some firefights, but nothing like running into, a couple hundred. The VC, as you know, wore black pajamas, and the people working the rice fields also wore pajamas. And if you went through a village, so it was hard to tell where the enemy was.
It seems as though the uncertainty of all that would be very difficult to deal with. How did you and your men handle that? Not really knowing where you would be going or what you would be encountering.
Well, that's probably one of the more difficult things. As a leader, the last thing you want is to have your men feel that you're uncertain as to where you're going and what's going to happen. And so, actually, when we landed on the wrong hill, I don't think any of my men knew it. My gunnery sergeant did, but we very confidently looked at the maps and aerial photos, and said, "Okay, we're gonna set up a defense right here," but we had no idea where we were, and that's always a strange thing when you're in a land that you've not familiar with. You're young and you got responsibility for a lot of lives. One thing I'll say about today, with the communication, GPS systems, the radio communications, fantastic. It's a little bit different situation for the military now, but it was pretty rudimentary. But as far as facing these things, that's your role as a leader, is to make sure that the people who are looking at you are confident that you know what you're doing. So Marine Corps does a great job of training you for that.
Well, you told me earlier that when you think back to Vietnam, you think about rats and snakes and dysentery. And you
Yeah.
actually lost 30 pounds while you were in country. With decades of hindsight now, what do you think about now when you remember Vietnam?
Well, I still remember that. I mean, it's funny. The lieutenant I replaced, he had caught malaria, and when I went in to introduce myself, he told me, he says, "You're going to learn to hate this place," which he had basically had it. Had been sick, and of course that's a lot. I knew I had 13 months ahead of me, so I had to make the best of what it was. I was fortunate to have a gunnery sergeant who was one of the most upbeat people you want. He was happy to be there, as often happens in the Marine Corps. He had 17 years, and boy, when we met, he said, "Boy, I've been trying to get here for 6 months." So he was. Fortunately, the Marine Corps is filled with NCOs like that, and but I will say that you don't have the comforts of home. We had mosquito netting over us. We slept on a cot. We slept on basically most of the year on the ground. Near the end of the year, they got what they call strong back tents, where the Seabees came in and put a plywood floor, and then they put that general purpose tent over the whole setting. So you had a feeling of some structure. But looking back and remembering, I was very fortunate that I came back in one piece. There were some people that were badly maimed. There were 11 people I served with who never made it home, and some of them, one was probably the greatest leader I've ever worked for, Colonel Loanessian, and he got hit with a direct hit from artillery round. So there are people like that made enormous sacrifices. And when people say to me, "Gee, you didn't see your son until he was a year old, and you missed all the anniversaries and birthdays and Thanksgiving," and I say, yeah, that was a sacrifice, but nothing like the people who never returned, because these men never came home to appreciate birthdays and anniversaries and family gatherings. So when I think of Vietnam, I think of the people who never got to live their dream. When I came home, I had lots of opportunities, and still do, and basically focused on how fortunate I was.
Well, let's talk about that time when you did come home. You served 13 months, and then you completed your commitment to the Marines and returned to New Jersey to go to law school.
Yes.
So you, as a Vietnam combat veteran, now find yourself on a college campus during a time when anti-war sentiment was rising around the country. Was that something you experienced, and what was that like as someone who had actually been there?
Sure. Well, maybe I should be ashamed to say this, but I kind of learned to keep my mouth shut because we would go to uh, parties at church or whatever, and inevitably I'd end up getting in an argument with somebody. And more so to defend not the war, but to defend the people that were serving there and the sacrifice. So I just went about my business. I didn't get involved in any kind of protest one way or the other. Uh, and in fact, there's probably many veterans who did the same thing. And, really didn't talk much about my experience. Maybe just mentioned something, but nothing in depth. And so that's basically what happened. I just there were people in my probably a lot of people in my class that didn't even know I'd been to Vietnam.
And how did that feel as the U.S. involvement in Vietnam wound down in the early 70s, and you saw other veterans coming home, and none of you really received a welcome home?
That's exactly right. There really was no welcome home. Nobody to meet us at the airport. Uh, you just kind of worked your way back into society. And fortunately, on my part, uh, I didn't have any traumatic injury mentally, as many people did, and there were no. So I wasn't in search of medical attention, or I was able to function, uh, but society in general was not real sympathetic to somebody that had served in Vietnam, and there weren't the services that have been provided recently. And it was amazing. Nobody ever said, thank you for your service until just recently. And believe me, it felt great to hear it. And it was my grandson, I think, told me the first time. And it's way overdue. Um, I think I mentioned to you, I got involved in an organization here in Scottsdale, one of the high schools, Veterans Heritage Project. And one of the things they do is students go out, they interview the veteran gets a chance to tell their story. Uh, the veteran connects with the student. And the objective is to preserve that heritage, to build leaders, because the students hear these stories of sacrifice. And, the book is published every year. Um, and it tells the stories. And one of the things I found is that several years ago, when my story was in a book, I bought one book for each one of my four children and for my siblings, and gave them the book, and they really learned for the first time. They could sit down and read my story. It was somewhat cathartic for me, as it is for many veterans, to tell their story. But through Veterans Heritage Project, they're honored, their stories preserved, and they connect with students. And they get, when we have the reception and hand out the books, it's just a fantastic day. We have events throughout the year, but that's the big one. And I've been happy to be a member or a board member for several years now. And currently, I'm actually serving as the board president.
Well, thank you so much. I think hearing your story really, I think, reminds us all how important it is that we do speak to those of you who have served, certainly our Vietnam veterans. And let me say to you personally, thank you for serving. Welcome home. I'm
Thank
very
you.
pleased to meet you and to get to know you a little bit. Let me ask you one last question. As you share your stories and speak with young people these days, what would you tell a young person who might be considering military service?
Well, when we go out and speak, we're not really encouraging military service as much as we are service, sacrifice, being more about what you can do in your community for your country, as opposed to what's best for you. And I have been just amazed. This high school students I've met, believe me, there's some great students out there, and they may go serve in a Peace Corps or somewhere else, but we want to emphasize uh, obviously patriotism, but also service to others, and that's what we emphasize.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I hope that you have as well, and I wish
Yeah.
you health. I look forward to the day when we can meet in person, and I'm excited
Yes,
for you because I know you're excited to help commission your grandson in the Marines here in the next couple
that's
of
right.
months.
May 15th. And Kelly, before we sign off, I want to tell you, we really appreciate what you're doing, what the people, the stories you're going to tell, many more, much more dramatic than my story, but every one story of service, and we appreciate you saying thank you.